Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Philip Lipsey, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of Global Japan here at the University of Toronto. I would like to begin with land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. In the course of this presentation, if you have questions, and I hope that you have many, please use the built-in Q&A feature on Zoom, and I will act as a moderator and ask these questions on your behalf at the end of the presentation. If you have questions or if you would like to join our email list, please see the email address indicated below. Now I would like to introduce our wonderful guest speaker for today. It is my pleasure today to welcome Professor Marie Soderberg, who is director of the European Institute of Japanese Studies at the Stockholm School of Economics, where she is also adjunct professor. She's also a guest professor at Osaka University. She obtained her PhD from Stockholm University in 1986, and she has published on a very wide range of topics, including Europe-Japan relations, Japanese influences in Asia, Japan-China, Japan-North Korea, and Japan-South Korea relations. Central focus in her very wide-ranging areas of expertise is Japanese foreign aid policy. She's also the chairperson of the executive committee of the European-Japan Advanced Research Network. Today, she joins us to speak about Japan-EU relations, two very critical partners and political actors of interest to Canadian audience as well. Their role in supporting and reviving the liberal international order, as many other countries have retreated. So I think it's a very timely topic, and we look forward to her presentation. So I will now turn it over to Professor Soderberg.
Thank you very much. I'm sitting at home, working from home. This is what we do to a large extent nowadays in Sweden with the COVID-19 everywhere. But I hope that this will work out really well. EU-Japan, as a director of the European Institute of Japanese Studies, of course, EU-Japan relation is one of the core issues which we deal with. And we have this wonderful network, European-Japan Advanced Research Network, with about 20 senior scholars all over Europe working on Japan. We meet annually and discuss various issues. And on many of those meetings, we also have had Canadian participants, actually. And 2 years ago, we came with a book together. We organized a conference where we discussed views on Japan, both from Canada and from the EU. And we had a publication with Routledge in London about that. We cooperated with something called Japan Future Initiative in Canada. So that was very nice. I also want to introduce another book before I start my talking, and that is about a book here called The EU-Japan Partnership in the Shadow of China and Crisis of Liberalism. My talk today, this is edited by Axel Berkowski, Christopher Hughes, Paul Milford, and myself. And my talk today will partly be built on what we came to in this book. In general, I think that EU-Japan, I will share my screen with you so that you see I have a PowerPoint also. I will put it up so we can see here. Yeah, here it is. I think you know at least the guy to the left, Prime Minister Abe, and then to the right we have Jean-Paul Juncker, who was the former president of the EU Commission. And why are they sharing? I think it's actually, picture is taken at the time when they signed the latest agreement between EU and Japan, which is the partnership on sustainable connectivity and quality infrastructure between Europe and Japan. And sustainable connectivity, that's really the EU keywords at the moment. And quality infrastructure is actually what Japan is pushing all the time. Now they've merged those together and made a new agreement. Some of the key things of those are to promote free, open, rule-based, fair, and non-discriminatory and predictable regional and international trade and investment. It's a lot about democracy, it's about human rights and values of various kinds. This is just the latest in a number of efforts which have in recent years been done between EU and Japan. Both try to revive multilateral cooperation in the face of US withdrawal from such agreements as the Iran nuclear deal or the climate agreement in Paris. And also due to the rise of a more assertive China. And for the protection of democracy and the liberal world order, Japan and EU seems like ideal partners, actually. Canada would be as well, but now I will speak on EU-Japan. The question is if the ongoing shift in the power balance, politics, and the crisis of liberalism, which we have and which I will come back to in a minute, will lead to broader and deeper cooperation. I'm not so sure about that, but to understand all of this, I first want to give you a short introduction to the historical background of EU-Japan relation. I think to a certain extent similar to what you have in Canada. After World War II, European leaders actually took little interest in Japan and vice versa. We didn't really go for Japan at that time. We were occupied by our own problems in Europe. And the US was the dominant partner. That was actually the same for Japan. And I mean, Japan and Sweden or Europe in general, we are far away. So not that much interest in each other at those days, during those days. There were in the early times, right after the occupation of Japan ended, bilateral relations were established between European countries and Japan. Another thing in Europe is that EU has not been in existence for all that long, and during those days we did not have the EU. There are a number of countries, and before the EU could get any power to sign any agreements with Japan on bigger things, it has to be more established. In 1970s and 80s, real cooperation was actually hampered by trade disputes. Economics and trade disputes were the main things between EU and Japan in the 70s and 80s. Politics, we didn't deal that much with Japan in connection with this. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Hague Declaration was announced between EU and Japan. That was the start of wider relation, pledging joint cooperation to deal with East Europe and countries in Asia. That's when we really got together, or really, we didn't cooperate all that much, but at least it was announced that we should cooperate. Another thing, I think, which lies behind the Hague Declaration was that EU was starting to get its act together, and it wasn't formed until 1993, but we have the EC still, but starting to talk about common policies and so forth. And what scared the Japanese more than anything else was probably the talk of what was then called Fortress Europe, that we would make a wall around Europe and not let outsiders in. I think that was one of the reasons why we wanted to, or in Japan agreed to step up cooperation in various fields, not only in economics, but in politics as well. That one lasted for 10 years. It wasn't that much happening during this time. But after that, there was a new action plan from 2001, a 10-year plan to broaden EU and Japan's influence and partnerships, actually. This plan had more than 200 items on which we should cooperate. Of course, this was too broad to get any influence at any time. And the year 2001, very quickly after that, we had those airplanes flying into the World Trade Center building in New York, and more of the talk became how to prevent terrorism and so forth. So not that much cooperation taking place here either. Although there was a system established for political dialogue in various fields, which were done. But then when this 10-year plan expired, geopolitics had changed. That was in 2011, and China's growing importance was acknowledged. In 2010, the EU had signed a strategic partnership agreement with China. And at the same time, we also had a free trade agreement with South Korea. And this led to the fact that Japan and EU both agreed now also to try to create a free trade agreement between the two of them. Was kind of the area, the time when free trade agreements should be done. So negotiations started, and this was a very long process. But the EU did not only want a free trade agreement, they also pushed for a legally binding strategic partnership agreement in the fields of politics, security, and development. This was something totally new to Japan, which had not signed any legally binding agreements on strategic partnerships like this with anyone else. And negotiations were ongoing. I would still claim that most of it was focused on the economic agreements, but strategic partnership was there. And the EU very clearly claimed that they would not sign the economic partnership, the free trade agreement, unless Japan also signed a strategic partnership agreement, which they eventually did. 2018, both were signed, and the free trade agreement started from February 1st, 2019. The strategic partnership agreement is partially implemented. Everything is not clear here yet. We will come back to that later. But it's on its way, and EU is a complex system, and all member states have to agree to this strategic partnership agreement before we can implement it fully. But during this time also, the rise of China, I would say, would be one of, if we are to analyze why EU and Japan got going like this, it must be the rise of China as one of the factors leading to it. There was an interest from the Japanese side to gear up with other countries, have more friends than the US as the world was changing. And actually the liberal world order got some really hard punches from China, who cannot be considered a liberal world order. And I'm sure you have Chinese people in Canada everywhere, and we don't mind them. We just sometimes mind the system, which is not so free and not so liberal. And that was, I think, one of the factors behind. And especially if we go back to this with sustainable connectivity and quality infrastructure, to a certain extent, it can be seen as a response to the Belt and Road project proposed by China. It's not that the EU or Japan are against the Belt and Road project, but they want there to be alternatives. Then we have another development recently also, Make America First again. This is Trump in the US, which I think really affected a lot of things, including multilateralism, and made the importance of EU-Japan cooperation more important than it had ever been before. Now there was no longer a protection. It was America First from Trump, not really protection of liberalism in the world in general. And concerning trade, he had been negotiating for the so-called TPP with Asian countries or countries around the Trans-Pacific, including Canada, I believe. And with the Europeans, they had been negotiating for a new free trade deal called TTIP. But when Donald Trump got to power, he canceled both those, although Japan and Canada and the others got together and created a similar free trade area. The Europeans also got together with Japan, and suddenly we had been negotiating the free trade agreement at the same time with when the US was negotiating both with Japan and Europe. But it didn't really take off until we realized that there would be no American proposal for a trade agreement. Then it seemed more important than ever that someone would stand up for law and order and free trade in the world. And I think that pushed the EU-Japan economic partnership or free trade agreement. And it is really a free trade agreement and might also be like a model for others how to conclude a free trade agreement. Another factor protecting the liberal world order in Europe, we have some deep problems as well. It is a very varied part of the world, and how can we claim this is a good system now when we have Brexit also? Brexit, which started this year and which looks like it's the UK is going to crash out of EU. Actually, we have problems in Hungary and in Poland with human rights, also with press freedom for media and so forth. So it's not all that easy with so many different countries as we have it in Europe. But the EU is the part, the glue that somehow keeps us together and promotes this liberal perspective of the world. Democracy is very valid for the EU, and the Green Deal and climate change are actually the big issues which are being pushed today. So we have this strategic partnership agreement. question is, will it make any difference? Will it make it possible to now go through and work on a grand scale more together? The Economic Partnership Agreement started already in February 2019, and until February 2020, it actually showed that it increased trade. I think by more than 6%, both from Japan, exports from Japan and exports from EU to Japan also increased 6%. So it had some importance. Now today, when we have the pandemic, the COVID-19, trade is going down everywhere, and we do not really know what will happen and if this partnership will have any importance. Strategic cooperation, yes, but still for the strategic partnership agreement, there is still no firm roadmap. There is a joint committee who discuss what to do together, but it hasn't really taken off on a grand scale yet. Some areas have been selected so far: security, climate change, nuclear disarmament, and infrastructure development in third countries, multilateralism also. Security, this is of course non-military security. You know, Japan and Article 9 in the Japanese constitution, they cannot send troops abroad. For the EU, it's even worse. We do not even have a military of our own. We have NATO, where some countries are members, but not all of them. So when it's a talk about security, between EU and Japan, it's in non-military ways. And here it's, of course, many things which are very, very important, which we can do together, including security issues, food, climate also, and fight against pirates, and also security in data. That's one of the most recent ones, where EU and Japan actually managed to get their acts together, and they now have a data agreement acknowledging each other's as partners to where you can send data without any problem. This is a big thing. Climate change, we both pursue that in the Paris Agreement and work towards a better environment. Nuclear disarmament, yes. Infrastructure development, not only at home, but in third countries, in Asia and in the Balkans. There are a number of projects going on, and I think there is a concerted effort to find new infrastructure development where Japan and EU could actually work together. Contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals and a better future for mankind. Can we make that through this cooperation? This will, of course, depend on geopolitical development in a globalized world with a quickly changing power structure, and where viruses like corona might change international relations totally. I happen to be the chairperson of something called the Sweden-Japan Scholarship Foundation, and our mission is to send young people from Sweden to Japan. We pick around 25 people every year. This year we can't send anyone. Europeans are not welcome due to the COVID-19. So of course, COVID-19 will have an impact on international relations. And quickly changing power structures. Here we also have US elections in a very short time. If Trump will be in power for another 4 years, I don't know. Maybe this becomes even more important if we have another president, Biden, might not feel as important as it is now to cooperate between Japan and EU to save the liberal world order. What about Canada in all this then? The preamble of the Strategic Partnership Agreement mentions Japan and EU as like-minded global partners when it comes to democracy, rule of law, and other soft values, like commitment of setting a just and stable international order. Canada is surely also considered a like-minded partner. And there is a strategic partnership agreement and an economic free trade agreement between Canada and the EU as well. And being part of this broader Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, Canada is surely also part of a free trade agreement with Japan. Yes, so let's see there. So Canada is there somehow. And according to my view, we had this book, which I showed in the beginning, which European scholars made together with Canadian scholars on Japan. And maybe we should also cooperate much more, not only in the academic field, but also among bureaucrats, if Canada wants to be part of saving the liberal world order, which I definitely think we should cooperate, that you want to be. You should cooperate with Japan, of course, but also EU is another partner which you might be interested in. And another thing is the importance of protecting multilateralism. We see that very clearly also now when we have the COVID-19. We need multilateral solutions. This is nothing that one country can solve on its own. We have to go together to be able to find a solution in this one. And of course, not only in this one, it goes for climate change, it goes for SDGs and many, many other issues. And Canada, EU, and Japan are still pro-multilateralism, which is an area where we could and should cooperate. And then getting back, I just want to show, I think you know the guy to the left, Prime Minister Suga, Japan's new Prime Minister, but also on the right, we have Ursula von der Leyen. I just showed the old leaders on the first picture. I want to point out that we have new leaders now. And the first thing Ursula von Leyen said to when she congratulated Prime Minister Suga to becoming the leader in Japan, and the first thing she did was to be sure that there were a direct line established between EU and Japan to promote the strategic partnership agreement. And maybe I should end here, get out of my PowerPoint, and we are ready for questions and answers.
Thank you very much. And so to our audience, please feel free to enter questions into the chat function at any time, and I'll ask those questions on your behalf. So thank you very much for a very interesting and stimulating presentation. As somebody who primarily studies US-Japan relations, it was very educational to get an update about where things stand between Japan and the EU. So my first question is, as you mentioned, there's a US election coming up very shortly, and at least if we trust the polls, which perhaps we shouldn't, it looks as though a victory by the Democrat Joe Biden is likely at this stage. And so I'm curious to hear your views on if that is the outcome and Joe Biden becomes the president of the United States. will it be back to business as usual? Or has the Trump administration done lasting damage in some sense to America's reputation or standing in the world such that it will be difficult for things to go back to where they used to be? Or on a more optimistic note, are these new forms of cooperation between partners like the EU and Japan, but also Canada, as you mentioned, can those actually strengthen the liberal order once the United States resumes its more traditional role as a defender of the order? So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on where would things go if the election turns out the way that the polls appear to be predicting.
If we have Biden as a president, hopefully we have a new strong partner on board again for multilateralism and a liberal world order, taking everyone into consideration. But I don't think we will be back to Obama days again, because this has gone so far, so that I think both EU and to a certain extent Japan now understand that they cannot depend only on the US, and the US power also to a certain extent weakened. So we need more friends if we want to keep the present liberal world order. So EU and Japan will continue, I think, and hopefully also Canada will broaden. Of course, you are even closer to the US. US is still far from EU, so it's not, it's even worse for you in that case. But I think even you have learned some lessons during the years that have passed, and will be very careful with how much you treat only the US, and will look for alternative solutions, and hopefully also for multilateralism, which is really badly needed in this world with the COVID-19, and if we are to obtain the sustainable development goals.
That's a good segue into the next question, actually, which is if you look at the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, Europe, along with the United States, of course, has been hit particularly hard. Whereas it appears that, at least based on the statistics, Japan has fared relatively well with fewer cases per capita and deaths and so forth. And do you see either lessons that Europe and Canada could learn from the way Japan responded to the pandemic, or greater avenues for information sharing of best practices, more ways that Japan and the EU could cooperate about pandemic response and dealing with what is one of the greatest international shocks of the modern or the contemporary period?
I definitely think multilateralism here again, and that there are several ways where EU, Canada also, and Japan could actually work together to spread information in third countries, and especially third world countries who do not have that advanced equipment for treating or even deciding whether it's COVID-19 or not, that people are having problems with. So I think this is an area where we could really cooperate. I think so, really. And why did Japan manage so well? Also, we must consider it's an island country. And it's a culture of, if you compare Japanese people with the South European people who loves to hug each other and kiss on the cheek and so forth, Japan has a culture of much more staying away. You don't touch the people you meet in Japan in the same way. And also, I think with those covering up your mouth, it's a long tradition in Japan. In Sweden, we have difficulties of having anyone do that. Actually, the authorities do not even recommend it to all people on buses and tubes and so forth. Feels kind of strange as Sweden to put something like that into your face. So I think basically island country, but also culture and hygienics are very good in Japan. They like to clean their hands many times a day and they like things net and proper. This is not the case everywhere not in the US and not in Europe either, I would say. So this might be some of the reasons why Japan so far managed to keep COVID-19 out. And also the very strict rules that are there now, where you can, from Sweden, you can't go without a visa any longer. So they will know exactly who is going in. We still have open borders. Any Japanese can come to Sweden. When they go home, they have to be in curfew for 2 weeks. They have to stay in a hotel or at home and so forth. Europeans can't go freely, and when they go, they also have to be in quarantine I meant quarantine, not curfews, quarantine for 14 days, and very cumbersome process. You can't have any people travel on those conditions. Usually, you go to Japan for a business trip will surely be not more than 14 days. And if you're going to stay 14 days in quarantine, no time left for business. This is a problem.
And of course,
So,
Sweden. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
We will see this also. I mean, the COVID-19, so far, all governments are giving lots of extra money to keep business going. But according to my view, this is not so easy under present conditions. And even if we don't see it now, I mean, COVID is breaking up supply chains, for example, all kinds of things. So it's going to change.
Thank you. And of course,
I saw something on the chat, but I didn't have time to read it.
I'll read it for you. But yeah, of course, Sweden has a very unique response to COVID-19 that might be a good topic for another conversation. But the question from the chat is, why have Japan and the EU been so hesitant in taking the anti-CCP line that the US administration is pushing on them and other allies? Is there an element of strategic autonomy or strategic vacillation here? That's from Anvish Jain.
This is about China, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's gradually, Europe is gradually going in that direction too. But China is also a big market for many of the European companies. And they don't want to give it up unless they have to. It's very difficult to, of course, the government, we are not very happy, and we have had many cases where they try to suppress press freedom in Europe also, where we protest widely. Slowly, we are also taking measures against, for example, Huawei in the telecommunication industry. It's not that simple either. You have to ask the customers what they want and how you go it.
And I guess on a related point, one thing that I've noticed, of course, is that if you look at Chinese initiatives like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Belt and Road, Japan has very clearly avoided being a direct participant in these types of initiatives. But among EU countries, there appears to be divisions. Some countries are quite enthusiastic, while others have refrained from participating. And so I'd like to hear your views on what accounts for this difference among countries in Europe in terms of their approach to these Chinese sort of marquee economic initiatives, and do you see much changing in that sense?
I think the first one to join the Asian Investment Bank was actually UK.
Not EU anymore, that's right.
But this was while they were still in the EU, and many countries, including my own, they wanted to join. Why did they want to join? Because they want a stake in how they put this bank up and how the conditions were going to be in the bank. They wanted to make sure that it would be a good international bank with transparency and so forth. That's why they joined. But frankly speaking, this is like in a bit like China's pet, where they can let foreigners come in and have some say on the conditions. The big Chinese banks, they are totally Chinese. And like China Development Bank, no one from abroad is being invited to join here, but here they found something where foreigners could join. And I think Chinese, I mean, they get backlashes themselves, also in Africa, where they are very strong now. They learn from being together with others. Also with Japan, to be very honest, of course, they are very worried about China, and they want law and order and know what rules that apply. But they are in very many of the Chinese projects. So they do not sustain totally, although they're not a member of a bank. They couldn't because the US did not join. So they had to take a decision there. But I think there are many people who thought that they should have joined in this bank too. And there are many cooperation projects where the Japanese are into China. So they are not completely closing off China either. And if we have another 4 years with Trump, China-Japan relations might actually improve in the economic fields, although in the strategic fields, it's a horror story for Japan.
And what about the Belt and Road Initiative? I've been reading that there's been some reassessment in Italy, for example, about their participation in the Belt and Road. Do you see any shift in the perceptions on the BRI in the EU?
I think so. More careful, but not completely no, because everyone knows that infrastructure is needed also in Europe, but they will be much more careful to protect the right to decide how it's working and how they want it. So yes, but at the same time, no. I would say they also support it. And I think also Japan and maybe also Canada understand that there has to be more infrastructure in Asia and in Europe, in the Balkans. That's very important. So they will try to get more into the process so they are able to govern in the sense so that China cannot decide the conditions completely on their own, but they have to then deal with European governments and get agreements to what they're doing. But of course, and also yesterday, actually, the Swedish government announced that Huawei are not welcome in the next 5G network that is being set up at the moment. So security is one thing, especially data security is very important.
Yeah, and that's a good seg for my next question is on these issues, kind of emerging issues like information security, space. Do you see active areas where Japan and the EU could cooperate on issues, again, where US leadership perhaps should be stronger, but is currently missing?
Space, definitely. And there has been a proposal from the EU to cooperate more closely with Japan on space issues. But also data. This has been kind of core for both Japan and for the EU, that they should cooperate to protect data also, so that it can not just be snatched up by someone else and used in a way that we do not want to have it. This, I think, is a very important area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned climate change in your talk, and I think there are many areas where the EU and Japan are, as you mentioned, cooperating quite successfully. But climate change is an interesting one. Of course, the general consensus, of course, is that all countries need to step up and do more. But there has been quite a bit of criticism of Japan in terms of its investments in coal-fired power plants and lack of ambition in its Paris Agreement targets and so forth. Where do you see climate cooperation between the EU and Japan currently, as well as moving forward? What is your assessment there?
I think this is also on technological issues. And Japan is an advanced technological country, and so are some of the countries in Europe. And here we will see a lot of cooperation, I think, a lot of funding going into finding more environmental friendly energy production, for example. So even if Japan might sound very strange, still keeping to coal power plants, they will eventually disappear, hopefully, from Japan as well, when they have other solutions. Maybe it's also because their economy is not that much booming. It's very expensive at the moment, although in the long term it will be profitable to change to other power sources. So I think Japan is also, Japan is living on a high technology industry, and they want to be part when the green deals are done, so to say. We want to have the capabilities and the companies who can really produce clean energy, and that is a business niche, actually. So I think they will be coming as soon as they have some possibilities.
Great. And you mentioned in the presentation, of course, that defense cooperation traditionally has not been a strong area for the EU and Japan. But of course, when I talk to officials in the EU, they frequently mention that defense cooperation is something on their agenda internally, that they want the EU to play a greater role. And of course, in Japan, we've gradually had an evolution in the direction of greater and greater capabilities and more permissiveness to certain kinds of military activity. And so do you see any movement on EU-Japan cooperation on these kinds of defense-related issues that reflects this evolution that seems to be going on both sides? Or do you still see this as sort of an area that's not very promising?
No, I think that we will try to support each other, but right now interests are quite diverse when it comes to military security. For example, in the Indo-Pacific Ocean, there's France and there's UK because they have interests there. If you ask any Swedes if we want to go and patrol make military patrolling in the Indo-Pacific, people would not think this is a good idea. We have Russia very close, and we have all the intrusion from Russia into the Baltic Sea, and that is where our interests are. And we cannot really expect Japan to come to the Baltic Sea to protect the Nordic countries against Russia. Why should we go all the way to the Pacific to actually protect Japanese interests? Of course, peace and prosperity is everyone's interest, so we want to cooperate for that. But really, there is a little bit of difference here on how to do it and how to see it. And even if Japan, they now are more proactive, they're contributing proactively to peace. I think the main thing that Japan really can contribute with are in non-military security of various kinds. And to a certain extent, this is also true for the EU. We have also those massive problems with migration from Middle East, people who are really bad off. We don't want military solutions. Here it's very difficult actually. So there should be other solutions. And there are other security issues also besides data, food security, very important, both for Japan and also for the EU, maybe also in Canada. I don't know. So there are other forms of security, and to be able, in Japan, they very much promote human security with Ogata Sadako as one of the front figures for many, many years. This is supported, I think, in the EU as well.
So I think in the interest of time, this will have to be perhaps the last question. But one idea, or at least proposal that seems to be floating around these days, is the idea that the UK could join the CPTPP agreement and essentially be part of that free trade framework. And I'm curious to hear what the EU perspective on this is, that the after Brexit, that essentially the UK is suddenly not part of the EU anymore, but is going to be part of the what was supposedly a Trans-Pacific partnership, and whether this could be the beginning of greater participation in the CPTPP, or some type of integration into that framework on the European side.
I'm not so sure about that. We will see where the UK is ending in general. The economy is quite bad there now, and they're gonna crash out in a month's time. So they will, of course, grasp any occasion that might turn up where they can become part of free trade networks. They very quickly managed to sign an agreement with Japan as well, right? UK, Japan has a free trade agreement. And I mean, I don't know. We will have to see where I couldn't really answer for the UK, but between EU and ASEAN, there is also talk of free trade and increased cooperation. ASEAN is a big power player nowadays on the world scene as well. And here we can, of course, imagine cooperation with others as well. Sorry, I can't give a clear answer there.
No, that's okay. I don't think any of us can speak on behalf of the UK. But I
definitely think that Canada and EU and Japan have mutual interests in rule of law and order and a liberal world order.
Great. On that uplifting note, I would like to thank Professor Soderberg for joining us today and sharing with us so much insight and wisdom about EU-Japan relations. And I would, of course, like to thank the staff at the Center for the Study of Global Japan and the Munk School for making this event possible. And to our audience, thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you again at future events.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.